What is the stealth genre? Well, that's a tricky one. We use genres to categorise different styles of art, entertainment and literature, including video games. Most, if not all, genres are in a constant state of change as more and more content is released and categorised according to its specific qualities. Video games are uniquely awkward to file into genres because they can be very different from each other even if they belong to the same series. However, they can still be categorised as shooters, racers, RPGs, and a host of other genres. Sometimes even blends of genres. Racing shooters, action RPGs, RTS brawlers. The list goes on. Trying to define any video game genre, even in the loosest possible terms, would be difficult enough. But defining the stealth genre seems trickier still. If you get a few stealth game fans together and ask them, so what's the stealth genre? The chances are that everyone will have their own interpretation on what a stealth genre video game should and should not be. There might even be an argument over whether or not the stealth genre actually exists, seeing as a lot of the more established video game genres out there make use of stealth gameplay, and have done so for well over a decade since stealth-based gameplay was popularised by the Metal Gear, Thief and Hitman series. The stealth genre should be in here somewhere. We talk about it all the time. The question is, how the hell do we begin to define it? Let's start with how stealth is used in most video games. First-person shooters, or FPSs, such as the Call of Duty series, regularly use slower-paced gameplay to inject variety into their single-player campaigns. Spaces where players have to sneak around enemies instead of shooting their way through them. The atmospheric Bioshock enable players to hide from enemies, if they were quiet enough, or if they had a certain power that granted invisibility. More dedicated attempts at stealth were made by Wolfenstein: The New Order, where players could take apart entire squads unnoticed, if they were careful. Dipping into role-playing games, or RPGs, we see character classes and skills that specialise in sneak attacks, camouflage, and trickery. All things associated with stealth games, yet altered to fit into the RPG game space. Pillars of Eternity, for example, features a dedicated stealth mode where player-controlled characters can avoid notice, position themselves around enemies, and detect traps. The Mass Effect games give players the Infiltrator class, which includes a very handy cloaking device they can use to hide from foes. Survival horror titles use stealth gameplay to intensify confrontations between their heroes and the monsters they have to face. Sometimes arguably not very good stealth gameplay, but stealth gameplay it is nonetheless. I could go on, but here's the point. Stealth gameplay mechanisms are popular methods used to augment the pacing in video games. So a lot of gamers are likely to have played something that involved stealth gameplay. Now we have to decide what qualifies a game as belonging to the stealth genre. This is not as easy as it sounds because genres have a habit of overlapping each other. They are fluid concepts, changing as more and more media is grouped under them. When it comes to defining genres for video games, there's an ongoing debate between two significant schools of thought: narratology and ludology. Simply put, narratology is critique and analysis focusing on narrative or story elements. Representation is crucial, the way in which people, cultures and ideas are presented, even in very basic terms. Narratology is seen by many genre analysts as an ideal way to define and categorise media, as humans have been a storytelling species for pretty much as long as we've existed on a cultural level. Essentially, narratologists are interested in how all media can impart information and stories to audiences. Derived from the Latin verb ludere, meaning to play, ludology is also a form of critique and analysis, but it focuses purely on games' interactive elements, actions and reactions within the game space. As gamers, we're used to talking about the way video games can be played on a mechanical level. We read and watch reviews looking at what we call gameplay all the time, and this is the stuff ludologists are interested in. When ludologists look at dividing up video game genres, they do so using their interactive characteristics rather than their narrative ones. So basically, this is the age-old argument of story versus gameplay. If we're to attempt to find the stealth genre, this means having to reconcile the genre qualities sought out by both narratology and ludology, and deciding which aspects can be used to define it. So what interactive qualities are peculiar to stealth-based video games? We can find out by looking at how they challenge players with their gameplay. All games have obstacles designed for players to overcome in some way or another. These obstacles can be broken down into two categories: passive and active. To demonstrate the differences between passive and active obstacles, let's look at one of my earlier favourite games, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles. Passive obstacles are predictable. They might form part of the in-game landscape. They might be a type of in-game enemy. Passive obstacles are not always used to hinder the player. Sometimes they can be used to the player's advantage. Such obstacles are designed to teach players important gameplay mechanics, as well as present minor challenges in how to move around and manipulate the game space. Active obstacles are designed to test player skills more thoroughly. In many cases, active obstacles are presented as in-game enemies the player has to defeat or avoid to make progress. Active obstacles will target the player, adapt to the player's actions, and try to impede them as much as possible within the confines of programmed behaviours. When we look at stealth-based games, we see something a little bit different. Specifically, I'm referring to the enemies we face. While many games will contain obstacles that are easily distinguished by passive or active behaviour, stealth-based games contain enemies that are capable of both passive and active behaviour. Players in stealth games are, by default, hidden from enemies. While undetected, these enemies are engaged in passive behaviour. They patrol and monitor the game space, scanning for signs of player activity. If a player alerts a passive enemy through their in-game actions, they will become an active enemy and attempt to thwart the player's success. Upon overcoming this obstacle by retreating from it or neutralising it, players may have a chance to hide themselves from any other active obstacles in the game space and complete their objectives. If they're lucky.
You're going down! There!
So this is our ludology criteria for defining the stealth genre. The interactive element that's common to all stealth-based games. Stealth genre video games contain obstacles, enemies, that engage in both passive and active behaviour. If the player is detected, passive obstacles become active obstacles and attempt to thwart the player directly. However, the ludologist's approach is not enough. If we use this criteria alone, here are a few of the games we could apply it to that most would agree are definitely not stealth-based. These games also use obstacles, enemies if you prefer, that are capable of both passive and active behaviour. While these may not be as elegant as the ones we encounter in dedicated stealth games, they are there nevertheless, and it would be too convenient to ignore this fact because of how well, or how poorly, a developer can add potential stealth gameplay to their games. We need more than the ludologist's argument to define the stealth genre, because, as this small sampling shows us and as we have already seen, there are stealth gameplay mechanisms in a range of video game genres today. And perhaps this is where narratology can help us out. So, what narrative qualities can we use to define the stealth genre? In a previous video, I looked at the history of stealth in video games, specifically how they began in a few select proto-stealth titles throughout the 1980s. What was interesting about these early video games was how players were cast in particular roles: spies, infiltrators, thieves, assassins, and covert ops soldiers. Fast forward a few years to 1998 when 3 of the most iconic stealth-based games were published, and we have Metal Gear Solid, Tenchu's Stealth Assassins, and Thief the Dark Project. All 3 games, and most of their sequels, cast players in a similar role to their proto-stealth counterparts, as a covert ops soldier, an assassin, and a master thief respectively. What about later stealth-based games? Well, let's see. Deus Ex players control a lone operative, Hitman Codename 47 has us playing as an assassin, Splinter Cell, a covert ops soldier, Sniper Elite, sniper. Assassin's Creed, an assassin, obviously. Warp puts us in control of an escaped prisoner. Dishonored, another assassin, albeit with supernatural powers. Gunpoint, a private investigator whose favourite pastime is corporate espionage. More recent examples include The Swindle, where we're playing as a gang of thieves, and Invisible Ink, which has us play the role of a spy organisation. When we think about the wide variety of gameplay in these titles alone, it's remarkable how the narratives centred on the player have managed to stay so similar. It's here, in the assigned player roles of stealth-based games, that we can define the stealth genre using a narratology-based approach. Note that all the player roles listed above are clearly presented from the outset in a deliberate narrative context. This isn't about what the player chooses to be within a game space, rather what the game intends for them to be within its contained world narrative. Stealth genre games cast players as characters who have an interest in remaining hidden as long as possible to complete their objectives. Assassins, thieves, covert operatives, spies, and other stealth-oriented roles. As with the interactive criteria for the stealth genre, by using just the narratologist's criteria, we'll end up with a bunch of games most would agree are not stealth-based. Alone, neither the interactive nor narrative qualities of stealth games can be used to define an overarching genre. If we add more restrictive criteria to these qualities, whether they're interactive or narrative, we could end up cutting out some of the games we're trying to create a genre for. The stealth genre is divisive for stealth game fans because it manages to do what a lot of other video game genres haven't done. It sits in the middle of the story and gameplay spectrum, rather than gravitating towards one side or the other, as many recognised video game genres are inclined to do. By accepting the idea that story and gameplay are equally important to video games, and bringing the two critical approaches of narratology and ludology together, this might form a decent set of criteria to define a stealth genre game. And these are some of the titles we could expect to see under it. As stealth game fans, we are too preoccupied with picking our personal favourites and using them as markers for perfection to determine what else fits into the stealth genre. But one example is rarely a suitable template. A genre is a space where new approaches to basic concepts can be accepted, appreciated, and allowed to push things forwards. By tying ourselves to one game, one series, one idea of stealth, we limit the possibilities. Perhaps this approach to clearly defining the stealth genre could be considered proof of that, but the outcomes remain to be seen.